Every week, I'm planning to be in conversation with one of the amazing people that I've met who are working in one or more of the areas that I have been fascinated about for most of my life. Judaism, Torah, LGBTQ identities, identity in general, and poetry. And each of the people that I've invited have really excitingly different perspectives than mine, and I can't wait to see what happens when we start speaking together. My first guest is Rabbi Jill Hammer. I'm going to read her bio, which is pretty great. This is the very brief version of it. She has a PhD as well as smicha. She's an author, teacher, midrashist, mystic, poet, essayist, and priestess, not always in that order. She's committed to an earth-based and wildly mythic view of the world in which nature, ritual, and story connect us to the body of the cosmos and to ourselves. She's the director of spiritual education at the Academy for Jewish Religion, a pluralistic rabbinical and cantorial seminary in Yonkers, New York. Rabbi Hammer, Jill, is also the co-founder of the Kohenet Hebrew Priestess Institute, a program in spiritual leadership for Jewish women. She's the author of many books, including Sisters at Sinai, New Tales of Biblical Women, and The Hebrew Priestess, Ancient and New Visions of Jewish Women's Spiritual Leadership. She's also a great friend, and she married me. And so I'm indebted to Jill in many different ways. And today, we're going to have a conversation that centers around the subject of imagination and religious tradition. I think it's common for people to think of imagination and religious tradition either as being separate, like they operate on different tracks, or as being opposed to one another. We think of religious tradition as focusing on continuity, stability, doing the same things, reading the same texts, setting up communal practices that bind together generations and groups that are disparate, and that keep alive the roots of a tradition so that it can keep growing into the future. We often think of imagination as really almost the opposite in a lot of ways, having to do with change instead of continuity, and transformation instead of stability, individuality instead of community, and breaking the past open, or just breaking with the past to open new pathways to futures that tradition may not have even been able to conceive. But in this conversation, I want to explore what I think is the much more complicated and much more mutually enriching relationship between imagination and religious tradition. And I can't actually think of anybody better in the whole wide world to do this with than Jill, because throughout her work as a poet, teacher, spiritual leader, scholar of Jewish tradition, female spiritual practices and mythology, and writer of liturgy and creator of ritual, Jill keeps showing me new ways in which imagination and tradition can intertwine with and cause one another to blossom. So Jill, I welcome, and I would love it if you'd start by just giving us an overview of your work beyond the long list of things I threw out there.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Joy. I'm really so happy to get to have this conversation with you and be in this sort of larger context to talk with you. Usually we are, having tea, and this is definitely more high tech. But I'm really very happy to get to be having this conversation with you. I really appreciate the way you framed this conversation in terms of religion and imagination. I feel that religion is often the sort of codification of a moment of imagination. So I really, I like that balancing.
Can I just, I'm sorry, you automatically said something interesting, and I don't want it to get passed over. Are you saying the codification of a moment of imagination? Are you saying that when we're engaging with tradition, for example, when we're saying a prayer that's been said a million times before, we should remember that that reflects an original spark of imagination somewhere.
Yeah, somebody wrote that prayer and they wrote it out of an experience, right? It didn't start out as the thing that everyone says, right? It started out as a creation that came out of a spontaneous experience. And I think it's really freeing to remember that, because it reminds us that we're really in the same boat. It's not like we're different than those authors. We're really doing the same thing in a lot of ways. So let me say something about my work. So I could think of myself as an imagination worker. That is a thing that encompasses a lot of what I do. I teach rabbinical students and cantorial students at the Academy for Jewish Religions. So some of my work is teaching contemporary and ancient midrash, liturgy, ritual, those kinds of things. As you said, I also teach for the Kohenet Hebrew Priestess Institute. So I teach a more sort of folklore-based, feminine-oriented version of Jewish practice and ritual. And the work that I like to do really has to do with how we meet the experience of living in the world, of being spiritual people, how we express what that means to us. So what are the stories we tell ourselves about that? What are the stories we inherit about that? And how can we be creative with those narratives that we've received? So I'm interested in that, for example, in the area of midrash, in the area of narratives that Jews have created around sacred text. How can we go deeper into these stories? How can they mean more for us? How can they address what's happening for us right now? I'm interested in the area of liturgy. How do we translate and create liturgy that is going to feel connected to the tradition, feel connected to antiquity, but also be relevant and meaningful to contemporary people? It's also important to me in terms of ritual. Like, how do we create ritual that doesn't feel alienating or doesn't feel rote, but feels alive to us and does the transformative work it's supposed to do? So those are some of the areas I like to work in and write about. And I both am interested in scholarship and write scholarship, and I also like to express myself creatively. So I've translated the prayer book a couple of times. I regularly am doing creative work around those topics. And also interested in the nexus of ritual and magic, and how do we think about the ways that we are magical people and live in a magical world. And that's really the work of imagination too.
Thank you.
I think, can I say one more thing?
You can say as many things as you want.
I want to say something about the ways that imagination is liberating also, that this is also liberation work. Because often certain kinds of imagination are threatening to established religious traditions, and those kinds of imagination often get ignored or put aside or forbidden. And that often ends up meaning that those traditions don't address areas that are really of importance to people on the margins. And when we use our imaginations, we can reopen some of those doors.
Can I ask you a question or two about that? Because that's a great, it's not a separate perspective. I know that that's woven all the way through all of the different kinds of work you do around this, but you refer to kinds of imagination. And do you find either personally or collectively that there are different kinds of imagination?
Certainly there are different ways of expressing what happens in our imagination. There are different arts that we use. There's writing, there's storytelling, and there's visual art, and there's music. And I think I was also maybe alluding to the ways that, at least in my contemporary life, we think about imagination as something we do for the creation of art. And then we also have imagination that that meets the imaginal world, that kind of meets the spiritual world in a certain way, so that we might think a little bit differently about that kind of imagination, although it's not really different. It really isn't different, I don't think. But it has a different valence to it, because we often feel sacred about that kind of imagination.
So to follow up on so there's one imagination, but it has different kinds of expression. And so going back to the original thing you said, it sounded like you're saying that traditions tend to be afraid that, because part of tradition's work is continuity, it's keeping things enough the same. And imagination is basically always the 3-year-old at services, right? It's always threatening to go off in some other kind of direction and disrupt things. So it sounds like you're saying that whenever we see a place where our tradition or our traditional practice is afraid of something and is trying to exclude something, we should recognize that behind that fear is imagination, that we're shutting the door, that our fear is shutting the door on imagination. And you're saying that whenever we do that, we are excluding possibilities that some of the people in our community may desperately need. Is
Yeah,
that right?
it's absolutely right. And I feel like that's really at the core of my work, is to unrepress some of these doors that were closed because
Mhm.
somebody in some hierarchy was afraid of them. Uh, the irony of how religion tends to deal with imagination is that it has this fear that you're articulating, and it also can't do without it. Because ultimately, religion can't capture people's imaginations. Religion can't offer people anything without this imaginal faculty. So in some way, it needs that faculty, but also desires to tame it in some way. And so there's this
Mm.
push-pull experience, and that's part of why, for example, Jewish tradition, has a tendency to be very worried about God being expressed in a female or feminine way, right?
Mm.
That's a problem, and yet that's an image that keeps arising and arising and arising in traditional sources. So on the one hand, there's a desire to keep out that image because of whatever danger it represents to the order. And on the other hand, it just keeps happening because it's part of the imaginal vocabulary, and genuinely spiritual people don't shut off to that because they can't.
I had an undergraduate philosophy professor named Elfie Raymond, who was so brilliant that I didn't understand anything she was saying. But I remember one of the things she said that I did understand was that fear is a negative use of the imagination. And I thought about that for years. And later I realized that in my own life, fear and desire were really closely related. And so I'm wondering if that's true in terms of religious tradition, that wherever you see fear, that is actually the imagination that's being repressed.
Yeah,
So when we say don't think of an elephant, we all think of an elephant.
right.
When we say don't think of God as female, well, you go there. And where there's a fear, we wouldn't be afraid of something if there wasn't a desire for it. Like, there are no laws against things that nobody wants to do.
Yeah. Yes, that feels exactly on point to me. That it's sometimes that's how I read biblical text. Like I look in the text, I look for what they're scared of, and I'm like, oh, let's go a little bit deeper into that. That would be good. Right, because as you say, no one's afraid of things that aren't compelling that nobody's going to do. Right, people are afraid of things challenging their system because they're interesting and exciting. Um, yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I I suppose we should also acknowledge that traditions are trying to do something that is functional for the human community, right? They're trying to create structure. They're trying to create community. So it's not just that the tradition is from some sort of malformed entity that is attempting to destroy imagination. That's not it, right? They have needs around structure, and they also have the that sometimes turn into oppressive structures, right? And they also have this need for imagination. But for those of us who are really pulled in the direction of sort of a free imaginal realm, like we're the ones who are going to go looking for the things that everybody's afraid of and say, oh, let's see what that is. Why is everyone afraid of this? Maybe there's something worth looking at here. Because that appeals. Just like if you tell a kid, like, don't look in the box, what are they going to do?
Exactly. The imagination is 3-year-old, and some of us are in the service of our spiritual 3-year-olds. We want to do the forbidden thing. But this is making me wonder, and conveniently leads into what we were talking about is the next section, which was zeroing in on Midrash and the Midrash tradition, and also some of the things that we've done with that. And you're making me wonder if some of the Midrashim, because some of them are just mind-blowingly strange, and I've never thought about them as acts of imagination that point to fears and restorations of things that have been excluded before. But I'm wondering if you can sort of, not everybody maybe have a background in terms of what this tradition is. I'm wondering if you can give us the thumbnail and then explore further.
Great. So midrash comes from a word lidrosh, which means to seek. And it is a name for a particular Jewish genre of literature and of thinking, in which someone is reading a sacred text and is interpreting the text, but is interpreting the text in an additive way. So little hints in the text, or even just things the reader is curious about, will then turn into longer and larger stories. So for example, why did Lot's wife look back? Right. And then there will be a whole discourse around, well, she looked back because she doubted, right? She doubted God's power to destroy the city, or she looked back because she still had children living in the city and she wanted them to follow her. Right. So we have these two different ways of understanding that scene, both of which give us a completely different picture of the person, right, who's being depicted in the text. So midrash is necessarily right on the line between interpretation of what already exists and imagination into what doesn't exist, which is probably why I love it so much. And it has been done in different ways over time, basically since the beginning of Jewish history. And certainly we have midrashim, from the 2nd century CE forward, in different genres as time goes on, and it's still being written, painted, composed today. And it's interesting to note the differences in how people tend to create midrash today, and also that there's still a lot of similarity, because the classical midrashists, of the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th century CE were really comfortable using their imagination to add things to the text that clearly are not there, right? I mean, if you're reading in any kind of literal way, right? But they feel it there, or that's how they visualize the text, and therefore they tell it that way. And that becomes the that becomes the text for them, and it's some amalgam of themselves, right? And the text that they're reading.
Can I pause here? Because it seems like you're describing two different processes that feed into the creation of midrash. One is, as you pointed out, the word comes from the verb that means to seek. So that's about curiosity, you said, that's about desire, right? That's the imagination. And a therapist of mine said that people are only curious when they feel safe. So that would be the seeking out of curiosity would not be an act of fear, that kind of protection of tradition and imagination, and it leads into new places. But the other thing that you just said, which is that as the rabbis who were doing this were reading the texts, they themselves were filling in the blanks in their imagination. And it's impossible to make any sense of the Torah without doing that. In fact, it's impossible to make sense of any language without doing that, because language always leaves out almost everything. It's designed to do that, so that, because the same words are created to fit the subjectivities of billions of people. So that means every word has to leave out enough for billions of people to use it to sort of wave in the same direction. When you tell stories, it's only the really bad storytellers who put in everything. the people you want to avoid at parties. And then I woke up and then I put one foot down, but then I realized, oh, the floor is cold. And you're like, oh, get me out of here, Scotty. There is no intelligent life on this planet. So one of the things about being a great storyteller is leaving out most of the stuff that actually is part of the story. And those holes create not only the invitation, but the need for your listeners to fill in the blanks. That's what suspense does in these other techniques. The Torah, measured against any standard of complete narration, is a total mess. It is riddled with holes and blanks and jumps and connections that aren't made. And so the rabbis couldn't read those stories without filling them in. But when you do that filling in, you aren't curious because your mind has filled in the holes unconsciously. So are you saying that Midrash works out of both the conscious curiosity and seeking plus the unconscious imagination, or am I getting that wrong?
That might be true. I have to think about that. But I think there's certainly a conscious element of we get to do this. Like the text has, in fact, they really felt exactly as you just expressed. The text has been written in such a way that we get to interpret it and find more in it than appears to be there. Right. So it's less that they're doing it unconsciously, although I think, as you say, you can't read a text without filling in the gaps. And that may be where this whole process started, right, is with the recognition that that's true. But there's also a very conscious sense, I think, of the play of the dialogue, the kind of relationship that you build with a text, via imagination. I'm thinking also about, for example, when Abraham's wife, Sarah, dies. It doesn't say why she dies, and then, they have to find her a grave, but there's no story. As you say, the Bible doesn't often tell stories unless it regards them as extremely relevant to the, the point of the, of the narrative. And so, you could choose to use a reading strategy where you say, okay, we don't know why this character died. Nobody told us. But that's not the reading strategy they used, right? They say, well, there must be something here. And so they look at the fact that she dies immediately after the story of the binding of Isaac. And they say, oh, this is why she died. And she heard about what happened and it was so painful, right? This is why she died. And so not only do they get an answer to their question, which I guess you could regard as kind of prosaic, but now they have so much more story, right? They have so much, they have the tragedy of this woman's death, and what happens to her in her last years, in a way that is really compelling and isn't explicitly in the text, but the gaps are there, right? And the juxtaposition is there. Those things are real. But and they're sort of they're going into that empty space and saying there must be something that was left. It's like a treasure hunt, right? There must be something that was left here for us to find. And often as they do this, they're unrepressing what has been repressed. Aviva Zornberg calls the Midrash the unconscious of the text, which I love. For example, the Bible does everything possible to depersonify nature. Right, nature never speaks. Trees don't talk. With one exception, animals don't talk. Right, but in the Midrash, the ocean talks. Like you see that all the time. So there is a level of unrepression of myth, in the Midrash.
Yes, that makes total sense. So in the case of the Sarah dying, I'm noticing that one of the holes that they notice, and if there are aspiring midrashists out there, Jill just sort of gave you the formula for creating your own midrash, is to first of all notice what isn't there. Notice something that the text doesn't see that you're actively curious about. So you need those two things. You need a hole and you need to care about it enough to imagine what is not there. And then you are on the road to midrash writing. Often what the Torah leaves out is human subjectivity. And often the human subjectivity that's left out is women's subjectivity. So we have only a couple of moments and we're lucky we have those couple of moments where the Torah talks about how Sarah feels or thinks. So it's particularly striking that, and there's nothing around this near sacrifice of her son. So it's particularly striking that that's what the rabbis restore in that midrash. And it makes me wonder if you are implying that they were unrepressing some of the horror of the Akedah, of the scene of the binding of Isaac and the near sacrifice.
Absolutely. Absolutely, I think they were doing that. One of the things that Midrash does is to also let you know something about the feelings of the reader around the text, right? So that the text essentially represses Sarah entirely in that piece of the story, right? Abraham never tells her what happened. She's never asked if, is it okay if I take your kid up the mountain and kill him? It's, the mother just disappears. It's like a Disney movie. The mother just disappears from the story. And the midrashists kind of knew that just didn't play. Like they understood that wasn't real, right? So in a sense, I don't know that anyone sat down and said, we have to put Sarah back in the story, right? At least not at that time, right? But in a sense that they're noticing the gaps, not just because they are gaps, but because they're gaps that are full of the potential to understand the story better. So absolutely, I think they're unrepressing in the sense of, here this mother waited, decades and decades to have a child, and now Abraham takes him up the mountain and nearly kills him. What could possibly have been her reaction, right? And and that curiosity and empathy causes them to, to tell the story in a new way. And I think that's part of why in our generations there is a particular desire to look at the margins of the story, so that people who themselves have felt marginalized or like their perspective has been put aside or not represented, right, often gravitate toward midrash as a way of asserting their presence, right, and their realness, by reading the text in the way that you do in your, your beautiful poem about Jacob and the angel, that you read that text in a way that nobody else could, because you have, you have a life that you're bringing to that text.
Thank you. And it also sounds like you're saying that by creating this practice of identifying what's not there in terms of the human experience, the classical midrashists establish a liberatory practice, because people who are marginal are always the people who are not there in the text. Now, my personal sense is that the Torah mostly cares about God and doesn't really care very much about people. So in some way, human beings are the marginalized group in the Torah, and we're always the ones who get shoved aside in certain ways. But it's also true that Jewish feminists seized on midrash as a way of enriching and restoring women's perspectives and voices. But in doing that, it's like both a radical move, but also a really conservative move. Or it's more like midrash plants this radical fusion of imagination and tradition.
Yes.
Very early in the development of rabbinic Judaism. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say that's absolutely right. And the way that they made it traditional was they said all of this was given at Sinai. All of the things that we are now pulling out of our imagination to say about this text, it was all already given to Moses. And therefore, we're not doing anything that is radical or new or contradicts the text or adds anything to the text. We're just playing our role in the unfolding revelation of this sacred text that was already delivered to us at Sinai. And that's how they somehow reconcile the radical nature of the literature form that they've created.
So they're saying that at Sinai, God has bound together imagination and tradition, and the individual imagination is God's way of conducting an ongoing revelation through individual human beings of the implications that are in the Torah.
Yeah, I think that's right.
God, that was a great idea of God's.
I mean, then you have to talk about what you actually think God's role is in all this, but right.
Yes, right. Yes, that might be for a different episode. But so I'm wondering if there are any questions that have come up, because what I'd like to do is transition from theory of Midrash to practice. I'd like to ask Jill to read and talk about a couple of her poems that create new Midrashim, and perhaps I will add one also. I'm not seeing anything. I'm sorry, I'm not good at this.
No
Okay.
questions yet, but just an invite to those who may have questions arise to submit them in the chat. And even if it's not at the precise moment that we're asking for one, we'll revisit them later in the episode.
That's right. We're going to keep pausing to see if there are questions that have come up before we move on to the next thing. So, oh, thanks, Sivan. Before we move on, this poem that Jill was referring to is called Wrestling, and it is in my most recent collection called The Future is Trying to Tell Us Something. We will have a break for shameless self-promotion here. Okay,
And it's
so
an amazing poem, and people should go find it.
So Jill, would you tell us about and read one of your poems?
Sure. So this is a relatively new poem that I'm going to share, but it's on a character that I've been exploring for a long time. I actually wrote my first midrash on this character. Well, second, I guess. My first midrash was on Eve, because, Eve. But the second one was Leia. And Leia is the wife of Jacob. She's not the only wife of Jacob. She shares Jacob with 3 other women. She and her sister, Jacob, the biblical patriarch, son of Isaac, son of Abraham, goes to his uncle's house, falls in love with his cousin Rachel, thinks he's going to marry Rachel, and at the last minute, his uncle, who's kind of a nefarious character, substitutes the other daughter, Leia, who seems to have something wrong with her eyes. She's not attractive. She can't see well. It's not exactly clear what makes her less desirable, but Jacob doesn't love her. But he ends up married to her, and then he marries the woman he's really in love with, Rachel. And so that sets up a dynamic, among these people. And then there are two maidservants who get thrown into the picture. And the tension is that although Rachel is the beloved, Leia is the one who keeps having babies, and sort of providing value in the patriarchal system in that way. So there's a sense in which, and Jacob is buried with Leia, and he's not buried with Rachel. So there's a sense in which Leia somehow, takes a role in his life that he never really wanted her to have, but that ends up in some way superseding her sister, who he loved. And the last thing I'll say is an introduction to the poem, is that later midrash in the Kabbalistic era, right, and there's a whole genre of Kabbalistic midrash, understood Rachel and Leia as sort of 2 types of this divine feminine. Rachel being the type of the revealed divine feminine, and Leia being the type of the hidden divine feminine. And
can you explain what that means?
I'll try. Yeah, I'll work with it. In the Kabbalah, there is an elaborate array of images of God that are different from one another. So God has multiple facets, kind of multiple characteristics. And those characteristics can be represented as things like the moon or the ocean, but they're really spheres within the divine. And some biblical characters are understood to echo these particular divine attributes that are called sphirot. And the sphira that Rachel is associated with is Shekhinah, is Malchut, is the feminine as connected to the earth and human beings. And the feminine that Leia represents is called the Ima Ilah, the upper mother, who is in fact the one who births the cosmos, but who people don't have access to in the same way.
Mm.
And they're both considered to be faces of God. And what this tradition about Jacob and Rachel and Leah says is that the reason Jacob doesn't love Leah is that he can't see her. Like she has a hidden nature.
Mm.
He loves Rachel because her reality is clear to him, is present to him, and he just can't relate to Leia. She represents something that is not revealed to human beings.
I feel like anybody who was dated in high school understands the difference between these two types.
Awesome. So I wrote this poem and I've written a lot on Leia. She's a character that I've always felt very close to. And in this poem just sort of came out in which I thought about, the poem is called Leia or the Real. And in some ways it's about how we marry the real world rather than the world we wanted. So it's called Leia or the Real. You don't like to look at me. I'm the world you got, not the one you wanted. I was the one under the veil all along. Misshapen womb for all that perfect seed. All your love wasted. You'll never forgive me. You hate me for keeping you from the beloved. And yet I'm the one who birthed a few things you hoped would come to pass. You can't squeeze much out of your faultless idol, but I have an astonishing fecundity. Each of my imperfect creations reminds you of how you don't love me enough. Don't put enough work into appreciating what you have. You hate me for being what you've got, but my, will you be sorry when I'm gone? I promise you'll bury me next to you. Something's not quite right about the face I show you. The eyes don't match. Your gaze can't alight on my asymmetrical form. As I lean muttering over the laundry, what you don't know and can't learn. I am right now birthing another beginning you could treasure. My all too solid legs are pillars of the temple. Praise comes out between them. I'm going to put it in the chat for people.
Thank you. While you're doing that, I want to note that some midrashim retell stories like in the third person, but some, like what you're of traditional midrashim, some of them give us access to the voices of characters that don't get to speak or don't get to speak at those moments in the Torah. And clearly this poem comes from the latter tradition. I'm also noticing that not only does Leia get the last word, you know, she gets to do that. And now that I think of it, a lot of the midrash poems that I've written are also people getting to say the stuff that, you know, like that you think of the after you have the fight and you're like, oh, I should have hit him with that. But she also seems to be speaking as a prophet. She seems to have a vision of the future that she's implying Jacob doesn't have. Am I hearing that correctly?
Yeah, I think that's part of what came out as I was writing the poem. The in the Kabbalistic model that I talked about earlier, right? Leah is the one who's identified with the sphere, with the realm called Bina, understanding. So in some way, she represents knowing, like that is her gift, right? Rachel's gift is sort of being, right? And Leah's gift is knowing. And I should say that that's also quite consistent with the way that the traditional midrashists understand the matriarchs. They're all understood as prophetesses. So something like that, I guess, is coming out here. I wanted to say one thing about the last line of the poem. Leia has 7 children, 6 sons and 1 daughter. Her 4th son is named Judah, which means praise. And her 3rd son is Levi, who becomes the line of the priesthood. So that's happening in here as well.
So what were you seeking that led you into this poem, and what do you feel you discovered? And was what you were seeking what you discovered, or did they not match up exactly?
I think it had been a long time since I went back and looked at this story. I did a lot of work with it early in my midrash writing. It was work that was definitely meant to deal with wounds and issues in my own life. And at some point I moved on from the character. You know, I went and wrote about other people and other scenes. And I had a desire to go back and look at her again. And from a perspective, decades later. And I saw something I think I hadn't seen before, which was the ways that Rachel gets to be the one who's never really attained. There's some way that, she dies young, right? She doesn't have the children, she wanted to have. Like, there's a way that Rachel is sort of, there's a distance between her and Jacob that's never really covered. And somehow Leia is the one who Jacob doesn't really want to be with, but nevertheless is closer to him in a certain way. Anyway, in some of the ways I feel that text. And so there was something about that for me. There was something about that, the Leia who is like the reality that we wish wasn't the reality. It's not perfect enough. It's not what we asked for, but it is what partners with us to make life. And when I saw that parallel, that was really what sparked the poem.
Beautiful. This is not at all a fair question, but I'm wondering whether in your poem you see them as ending up loving one another, or do they just get stuck with one another?
I don't know that there's an answer to that question that stays the answer. I think you could look at the story many times and have many different answers to that question. But I could imagine them coming to love one another kind of in the way that Tevye and Golda do. Like, oh yeah, I guess I love you, let's go milk the goats. That's kind of how I imagine Leia and Jacob, is like in the end discovering that they did love each other, but not in an adolescent passion kind of way, or a sort of romantic beloved kind of way, but in a sharing their lives together kind of way.
I'd like to ask somebody to write that musical. I think that would be a great sequel to Fiddler on the Roof.
Oh my. It would have to be in Hebrew biblical Hebrew rather than Yiddish, I guess.
Yes, it would. I have no sense of time, so I'm just going to quickly check. Oh, we are running out of time. So, Jill, do you want to read another poem? Do you want to make time to talk about Sefer Yetzirah? What would be your choice right now?
I would like to hear a poem from you.
Oh, okay. Which kind? You're the guest. You get to pick.
Oh my. Well, since we're on, I think you should either do a Shekhinah poem or your David and Bathsheba poem. Well, I don't know. What do you think?
Sivan was just asking for the wrestling poem that you referred to.
Do you want to read that one? That would be great. I
am game for that. And this is interesting because so Jill gave this poem a new life. So the poem has an original life and meaning, and then Jill resurrected it, the same words, but with a different meaning, which I also really like. So this is a midrash on the passage from Genesis, and he rose up that night, and he is Jacob. So this is Jacob. He's still with Rachel and Leah. He's fled from his father-in-law, and he's unfortunately about to meet Esau for the first time after screwing him out of his blessing. And the even worse news is that Esau is arriving to meet him with 400 armed men, which is the way everybody says hi to a long-lost relative. 400 rent-a-cops, and I will celebrate your return. So he's having a bit of a crisis there, and he's imagining that everybody is going to be slaughtered. So he sends over his whole family to the other side of the river, and he stays alone all night. And he famously encounters a figure which is tradition has identified as an angel. The Torah's a little coy about whether it's an angelic figure or a human figure, but they wrestle all night. And Jacob ends up winning a new name, Israel, and a new kind of a blessing, but he's permanently lamed by the encounter. So this is called wrestling. You wish you'd stayed on your family's side. Not that you're losing, not at all. The angel's wings snap in the vice of your thighs. The angel gropes, searching out the sinew of light, the blessing you stole in disguise from a father who could only love what he couldn't recognize. The angel threatens to kill, to die, claims to be your father's God, your father himself, abashed and blind, the fear that took his eyes. You wish you could let him go, lose to keep him alive. Dissolving in the breaking light, he begs you to let him fly, his feathers melting, running down your thigh. So when I started this poem, I think what I was seeking in the Torah was something that would speak to my sense of being a wounded child, like that I had to hang in there with my family. Maybe all I'm saying is I'm a child who had a childhood. But anyway, I had to hang in there with my family, and the hanging in there meant that I was wounded. And this was semi-conscious, but in some way, Jacob's experience in this wrestling match is the template of a relationship where you have no choice but to hang on. You can't win. You can't defeat the opponent. Like if you love somebody, you can't actually, you don't want to destroy them. You want to survive them. Children, I think one of the greatest gifts children can give their parents is to survive us. And to hang in there no matter how we wound them, and to go on and flourish anyway. And if you're the child and you hang in there, you come out with a new identity, a full identity, an adult identity, one that is not only you as you are in the family, but you as you are in relation to the future and the greater world. None of this was particularly articulated. It just had this sense of a struggle that you couldn't win and you couldn't stop. Then it's sort of more specifically centered around my relationship with my father, which was abruptly terminated, not because he died, but he just stopped relating to me. And so I was stuck wrestling with somebody who wasn't there. And then the really awful thing was that I realized that he wasn't there, so I could win any time I wanted to. Like there was nobody else there. I get to have it any way I want. And that was even worse than having him there and being in an active fight because it was all in my hands. And then it got tangled up with gender transition because in order to become myself, I felt like I had to be like my family was on the other side of the river. And I was doing that to protect them. And I also really missed them. And I was going through this process where I had to hang on and I would come out with a new name and a new destiny on the other side. So all of those things were things that I brought to the story. And then Jill, you did this beautiful reading of the poem in relation to queer experience, which I thought, oh yeah, that's what I should have meant all along. That sounds really good. I like that.
It was
And
good
then
all
well, right, you know, thanks to you, the meaning of the poem kept growing beyond me, which any poem that is going to be worth anything had better grow beyond me.
along.
Otherwise, it's not going to be much of anything. I think I saw a question.
We have several questions.
Yes, we have two questions, and I'm happy to. So the first one's a biggie from Val Schlossberg. So one of the pieces, this is for Jill. One of the pieces of Midrash that you wrote that was really transformative and magical for her is the story about Miriam at the mountain, where she receives the spaces in the Torah as a gift from divine. The spaces are what allow the meaning to be created, just like the hollow of a drum creates the sound. Thinking about everything you've been sharing about Midrash coming out of spaces in the text, I'm wondering if you can speak a little to the spiritual experience of engaging with these holy holes, and if or how that has changed your understanding of our relationship with God.
Great, thank you, Val, for the question. And I'm going to actually weave it into my answer to Katie's question as well. Katie asks, are there any stories you keep approaching but can't figure out how to give narrative to yet? And the answer to that question really is Sinai. Like there's a way that I'm still struggling with that story. Like that's a story that's hard for me to approach because of the sense of revelation as this kind of one-way process, right? You know, God gets up on the mountain and tells everybody, you know, the thing, and then everybody has the thing. And you know, in the Midrash, it's not really quite like that, right? Everybody, you know, it matters what people receive as well as what God offers. But this whole notion of revelation is something that occurs in this direct and vertical way, you know, is something that I really struggle with. I really don't know quite what to do with this view of revelation because it has never. It's a beautiful story. It's an amazing story. It never has quite sat in a. It's very opaque to me, that story. So the story that I wrote that Val is referring to is called Miriam Under the Mountain. And it's about how while Moses is going up onto the mountain to receive Torah from God, Miriam finds herself being drawn into a cave below the mountain where she receives, you know, basically the empty space that surrounds the Torah. So in some way, this story was kind of a descendant of other feminist poems in which Miriam, you know, somehow edges in on revelation and, you know, receives the, you know, the white spaces, you know, the opportunity for midrash, basically. And you know, looking back at that story, what I love about that is that what Miriam receives is not about content as much as it is about depth. Right? Miriam receives space, right? She receives the opportunity for meaning to grow, right? Rather than a defined meaning. And I think that there's something that's so resonant for me still with that what Miriam needs to receive is the place where the divine and human meet, right? Not a specific communication, you know, like, you know, you would give to a messenger to carry to the next office, you know, but a space within which meaning can be co-created. That's you know, that's really how I think about revelation.
So the story at Sinai that you imagined for Miriam gives the story of Sinai everything that you feel is not in the Torah version. Would that be right?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, in some ways, Jung talks about the ways that the up direction and the down direction are both sacred directions.
Mm.
But in the Bible, the up direction tends to be the sacred direction, right? You go up mountains, you go up to clouds. That's how you contact the divine realm. And like lots of like millions of other people, I'm kind of frustrated with that narrative. I love the idea of the cave as a place of revelation, and that actually is also quite classically traditional. I mean, you see revelations happening in places of depth, and that that feels important mythically.
What you just said reminds me of these lines from the poet Cesar Vallejo that I love, which is he's a very exclamatory poet. He's a Spanish language poet. To rise always and never go down. Don't we rise really to go down?
Yes. That's awesome.
I think there was a request by Tori to speak about the queer reading of the wrestling poem.
Okay, I'll do that. And then maybe you want to say if there's a story you haven't figured out how to narrate yet.
I'm hoping we'll run out of time, but we'll see.
Okay. So when I read the wrestling poem, Joy's wrestling poem, which is a poem that I adore, what I immediately saw is that Jacob is winning and doesn't want to be winning, right? Because what's happening in that scene in the Bible is that Jacob is in some way individuating in a new way, right? He's receiving a new name. And and the wrestle with the angel kind of allows this individuation, this sort of new identity to emerge. And what I saw in Joy's poem was that the angel is winning, right? The new identity is happening. Like there's nobody can do anything about that. That's what's happening. And the angel, who is the father, is ultimately losing, right? Is ultimately not going to be able to keep that new identity from forming. And yet the wrestler feels obligated in some way to keep wrestling with the father, to keep sort of preventing him from knowing that he's lost, right? From knowing that there really is nothing that he can do to hold on to the identity that was never real to begin with. And I think, I mean, Joy, I for me, that so spoke to the ways that you have become a voice for the development of new identities, even when families and societies get sad about it, or are rejecting of it.
Thank you. And it gives me an opportunity to say that one of the things that I got out of my very, very bad divorce was I got to really hear about the process of mourning that happens when we outgrow or leave behind identities that people who love us identify with us. And in some way, it's strange because in some way I feel like the person that I was growing into would not have been whole if my ex hadn't opened my heart to the pain of loss of the people who loved me. Because somehow that loss is where the love that we had was, where the reality of that love was. And also because I think my wish was to grow into somebody who would just start fresh. This would be sort of like a very small but beautifully luminescent soap bubble self, where there's not much inside it. It's floating off. It's not very large. It's kind of perfect, but it doesn't hold any of the suffering and messiness of the life that came before. And that wasn't really the person that I needed to grow into being. I needed to grow into a person whose new self included all of the truth and all of the love and all of the loss and grief of the self that had come before. And I think in the wrestling poem, it is an attempt to freeze at that moment of becoming and loss and failed try to for protection. And also maybe what you just said maybe made me realize the acknowledgement that the people who are holding you back are also the people who are enabling you to grow into who you need to be. Like, you're going to grow through the people you love, whether they like it or not. Something that I will try to remember the next time I have a fight with my 16-year-old. Oh, he's just growing into the person he has to be, whether I like it or not.
Right, you are. Wow.
I think we are probably, yes, we're out of time. And Jill, I want to thank you so much for doing this. What a treat it has been for me to have this kind of time with you. Thank you. And thank you so much for the incredible work that you've done and continue to do. For those of you who don't know Jill's work, you just caught the tiniest glimpse of how mind-boggling and life-expanding and generous it is. So, as Hillel says, while standing on one leg, go and learn.
Thank you, Joy, so much. This was a wonderful conversation. I feel like it's going to resonate inside for a long time.
Yes, thank you to both of you. Thank you to Joy Ladin for this new incredible program that we're going to be running weekly. Please come back. It's going to be awesome. I mean, that's clear. It's going to be awesome. It's been awesome this time, and Joy Ladin has so much more Torah to teach us. Thank you, Jill Hammer, for just being an incredible inaugural guest to help launch this awesome show. Joy, I'm not looking. Remind me the name of the title of this beautiful.
Containing multitudes.
Containing multitudes. Containing multitudes. Tell your friends. I will remember better for next time. We should all be telling our friends and committing that title to memory. There's many other Jewish Live programs that are rolling out, and we strongly encourage you to check them out. There's just incredible Torah teachers by the handful, just pining for the opportunity to teach all of you, to learn from all of you. You can learn more at jewishlive.org. And in particular, if you want to catch up on classes that you've missed, or if you want to send folks a link to this session, if they missed it, you can send them to jewishlive.org/originals for our original shows. I just put the link in the chat. For this show, it's not going to show up immediately there, but it will be there within the next day or so. So you'll be able to share with your friends. But check out our other Jewish Live programs. What a thrill, what a pleasure to learn with all of you and from the two of you. We're going to close the live stream, but be back soon.
Thank you, everyone, for coming.